Why hello there, and welcome back to Let's Make Us a Character. And in this episode, I will be continuing my descent into the tunnels with Tunnels and Trolls 5th edition from 1979, which is something of a step up for Flying Buffalo. For one thing, taking a whole 2 years to come out versus the previous 4 editions in 3 years, but also being a perfect bound 96-page tome with a full color cover, versus the previous editions which were all 40 to 50 pages and stapled or comb bound. And this is also the first edition to actually be rewritten instead of just patched together with new and revised rules. Well, partially rewritten. More rewritten than previous editions. Basically, this was the big leap from zine to professional quality book, and this edition even had a box set version available. Although they did have something of an issue shifting from the 1-column to 2-column format, and for some weird reason, it is laid out in a bizarre section and subsection system instead of like chapters and page numbers, which is what they used in all the previous editions. But most importantly, from a legal perspective, it also no longer mentions Dungeons and Dragons by name, and has replaced Dungeon Master with Game Master, which is a little weird as according to my research, Dungeon Master was not trademarked by TSR until the 90s. And Flying Buffalo was also way less cautious about using other trademarks that they very much should have known they did not have the rights to use. Also, remember in the last video how I said the version history was odd and confusing? Well, this was followed by a version 5.5, also available in standalone book or box set, released in 2005. And you might be thinking, oh, well, so they put this out and then brought it back 25 years later. But no, Flying Buffalo was actually publishing content for this edition through 1993. So yes, there was a very large gap, but 5th edition was actually actively supported for more than a decade. However, I don't actually have 5.5 because the PDF version released in 2017 is the classic 5th edition, not 5.5, and there's just no convenient way to get 5.5. And from my research, it does seem that 5.5 just added some additional optional rules in the back and a copy of Buffalo Castle, rather than really revising anything. And from what I have read, some of those optional rules do sound interesting, but I do not have access to them, and likely neither do you, so they're not really worth getting into. And if you think that's weird, just wait until next time. But before we get into it, I do need to tell you about the Goblin Guide to Advanced Dice Rolling. An introductory guide to dice math and mechanics so simple even a goblin can understand. A simple-to-digest tome which teaches you the ancient secrets of probability and other dark maths that let you do things like roll a d40 or a d16. You know, the weird dice stuff that I do sometimes in these videos, but also looks at how those maths are applied to your favorite games to translate numbers into adventure. So if you're a tabletop game designer or just a simple dice goblin, the Goblin Guide to Advanced Dice Rolling is an invaluable resource for learning the ins and outs of your favorite numbered polyhedra. So check out the Kickstarter for all the details, unless you are watching this after the Kickstarter ended, in which case, now available. And now, let's make us a Tunnels and Trolls 5th edition character. Once again, characters are simple enough to be tracked on a card, which is once again recommended, and a sample character card is provided in the book, which I will use to save time. And just like in the previous editions, characters have 6 prime attributes: strength, intelligence, luck, constitution, dexterity, and charisma, each of which are rolled with 3d6. But before I get into what those do, I must discuss kin. While the function of player race is the same as in previous editions, as a concept it has been moved into general character creation instead of more of an optional thing in the elaboration section. So once again, our options are human, dwarf, elf, fairy, hobbit, and leprechaun. Yes, hobbits, in at least the version that I have. Honestly, whether or not it still says hobbits is probably the thing I most want to know about 5.5. And the modifiers have been adjusted somewhat to be a bit less ridiculous. So humans, of course, receive no modifiers. Dwarves still double strength and con, but now also reduce charisma by 1/3. Elves still increase intelligence and dexterity by half and double charisma, but no longer increase luck by half and now reduce constitution by 1/3. Fairies still reduce strength and constitution by 3/4, increase dexterity by half and double charisma, but now only increase luck by half instead of doubling. Hobbits remain unchanged, including the fact that they are called hobbits in 1979, which is after TSR had already had to switch to halfling, and get 1/2 strength, double constitution, and 1 1/2 times dexterity. And leprechauns still get half strength, but no longer half their constitution, and also now increase dexterity, intelligence, and luck by half. So, a really big upgrade for the leprechaun. You might be thinking, but hold on to that thought for a bit. And beyond the adjustments, there's still not really any kind of racial bonuses or penalties, although in this edition they have suggested things that certain kin type might be better at, such as dwarves being able to assess the value of gems, elves having better hearing, and hobbits being stealthy, but not providing any mechanics to go along with those beyond the attribute adjustments. They've also revised the flight rules for fairies, so now any fairy can fly as long as they are carrying no more than 1/2 their total carrying capacity, versus previous editions where fairies could not fly if they had a strength score above 2, which was very dumb because it rendered about 1/3 of fairies flightless, which makes very little sense for a flighted species. As for leprechauns, well, once leprechauns were the most misunderstood character race in TNT, and this despite their engaging presence in Western mythos. We hope more players will find the new leprechauns of sufficient interest to ensure their presence in dungeons everywhere. So, they seem to have acknowledged that leprechauns were the objectively worst option in previous editions, and are attempting to remedy that, so that's great. Surely they wouldn't make them worse, would they? So yeah, leprechauns can only be wizards, and just in general that is not great, but they also make it specifically bad. They do gain the ability to inherently cast a level 4 teleportation spell at a massive discount, which is good, but since there are no wizard schools in the land of the leprechauns, they don't learn spells like wizards do, but rather like rogues. And I will explain that difference in a bit, but for now you just need to know that leprechauns are restricted to not just one specific class, but a further restricted version of that class, and are the only kin type to have any restriction on their class options, which is a choice. And looking at our stats, we really don't need a boost to our dexterity, is what I would be saying if I were a coward, but I am not. I am something of a silly goose, so let's have ridiculously high dexterity. And our constitution is not great, so I don't want to be an elf or especially a fairy, since those would lower it even more. And of course, don't want to be restricted to a restricted version of one specific class, so a filthy little hobbitses it is. And notably, there are also rules for benevolent were types, which were also in the previous editions, but explained so poorly there that I didn't even bother mentioning them, And here they are more or less usable, but also heavily broken, so worth mentioning but not explaining. And now that we have our adjusted attributes, let's go through said attributes. Strength contributes to our combat adds at the rate of +1 per point over 12 or -1 per point under 9. So our strength of 6 provides total subtracts of -3. And yes, bonuses and penalties are called adds and subtracts, which are terms that I very much do not like. Strength also determines our carrying capacity, which is equal to our strength times 100, so 600 weight units, which are equal to 1/10 of a pound, and is a term that I actually do kinda like. However, carrying capacity has been changed a bit in 5th edition. So now you can only carry an amount of weight up to your capacity for a number of turns equal to your constitution, or up to twice as many turns when carrying no more than half your capacity. And you can also lift up to twice your max capacity for 1d6 minutes. Intelligence is used in determining level of spells that can be cast, as well as the effects of certain spells. Characters also gain 1 additional language for each point of intelligence above 12, so with an intelligence of 10, we only speak Common and Hobbit, for being a Hobbit. Although, they did actually include a language table in this edition, which very notably includes both high tongues like Elven and Hobbit and Trollish, but also animal languages. So your character can just learn to speak cetacean, making this objectively better than every edition of D&D or other games where you can't just learn to talk to whales through non-magical means. Luck is used in saving throws, determining the effects of some spells, and also contributes to combat adds the same as strength, but luck of 9 is no adjustment. Constitution is hit points essentially, and 18 is a lot better than 9. Dexterity is used in determining the accuracy of range attacks, the levels of spells that can be cast, and also contributes to the combat adds like strength and luck, although the dexterity bonus specifically is doubled on ranged attacks, and our dexterity of 27 grants +15 to melee and +30 to ranged attacks, which added to our -3 from strength is +12 and +27 overall. And Charisma has some minor effects. It is used in determining the effects of certain spells, and with a Charisma of 12, we are considered to be average. Then let's roll our height and weight, and 5'1" and 160 pounds, adjusted by 1/2 each for our Hobbit modifiers, so 2'6.5" and 80 pounds. Which is another one of those things where you really do have to question if hobbits were supposed to be proportionally 4 times as heavy as humans, or if they just went, yeah, half the size of humans, so half as tall and half as heavy. That's how math works, right? And my instinct is to assume the latter because the 1/10 and 1/200th adjustment for fairies seems to understand the concept, but is still off by a factor of 5. And they did actually remember to include modifiers for leprechauns this time, but unfortunately also changed the elf adjustments to 11/10 height and no adjustment for weight, versus the 5/4 and 3/5 adjustment in previous editions, so elves no longer average 7 feet tall and 105 pounds. And next we must choose a character type. We now have 4 options. Warrior, Wizard, a change that I must assume was due to some belief that TSR somehow had a magical trademark on the term magic user, because that is the objectively better term. Rogue, and now as their own thing, Wizard Warrior. And the classes are all pretty simple, so I shall explain them all right now. Warriors can use any weapon and double the effectiveness of armor and shields, but cannot cast magic of any kind. Wizards can use any form of magic, but are restricted to 2-die weapons, which is the new minimum, but now also do get their adds with any weapon they can wield within that restriction, and are the only class that can create their own spells at higher levels. And I made a magic user in the previous video, and magic has not changed, so if you want to know all the ins and outs of magic, watch that video. I will, however, be doing a magic crash course right now because I have to do so in order to explain the difference between the next 3 classes. So, wizards start with all level 1 spells, with higher level spells needing to be learned from the Wizards Guild at the cost of 500 gold per spell, which increases by 500 for each level of spell beyond 2nd. Spells are cast by expending strength points, so for example, casting Take That, You Fiend would reduce strength by 6, making strength an incredibly important attribute for wizards. And while you can raise your strength later as you level up, it does make taking an initial 1/2 or 3/4 cut to strength something of a huge handicap for any magic using character. However, the cost can be reduced by a number of points equal to the character's level to a minimum of 1 by using a magic staff, and is further reduced by the difference between the caster's level and the spell level. So a level 3 wizard casting Take That, You Fiend with a magic staff would only expend 1 point of strength, the base 6, -2 for the level difference, and 3 from the staff. And now that that is all more or less sorted, rogues can use all weapons and magic, which sounds great, but unlike warriors, do not get the double effectiveness of armor, and unlike wizards, do not start knowing any spells, nor can they learn spells from the Wizards Guild. Rather, all spells must be taught to them by a wizard, which requires the use of a level 1 spell, and is specified that it should only be allowed from another player character, and that they should charge as much as they can for the service. So, no finding a friendly wizard in town between adventures. They also just flat out cannot learn spells higher than 7th level, cannot use a magic staff, and do not reduce the cost of casting spells of lower levels. And arguably all of that was true in the previous editions, just not spelled out as clearly, but the most important difference here is that now they specifically can continue advancing beyond 7th level as rogues without any further restriction beyond not being able to learn those higher level spells. And finally, Wizard Warriors, which in 4th edition were literally just what you called a rogue who advanced beyond 7th level, but is now its own thing, kinda. Wizard Warriors can use any weapon and increase the armor bonus of a full set of armor and or shield by 1. They can also use any magic and do start with all level 1 spells, but just like a rogue must be taught any additional spells by a wizard. They also can use magic staffs, but only reduce the cost of casting lower level spells by 1 per 2 points of difference. So a 3rd level wizard warrior casting Take That, You Fiend with a magic staff would have to pay 2 strength, the base 6, -3 from the staff, but only 1 from the level difference. And you might be thinking, wow, that sounds kinda overpowered, especially when compared to the rogue. And yes, they are, which is why you need to have unmodified scores of 12 or higher in every attribute to be one. So basically, character type affects a character's ability to do 2 things: fighting and magic. Warriors are good at fighting, but completely deficient at magic. Wizards are good at magic, but bad at fighting. Rogues are okay at fighting and bad at magic, and wizard warriors are okay at fighting and magic. But there's also a secret 5th class that's bad at fighting and only okay at magic. That's right, I'm going to complain about leprechauns some more. And boy, do I wish that sentence was not so incredibly on brand for me. In terms of party construction, rogues and even wizard warriors are very clearly intended to be secondary magic users, as they require a primary wizard in the party to learn new spells. Like the book specifically says, rogues should only be taught spells by wizards of another player. So the GM would be well within their rights to say, without a wizard in the party, you are not learning any new spells. That is, of course, unless you invoke the vague rule of Of course, if a rogue comes upon a means of learning spells while in a dungeon, this is completely fair. Man, I love classic games and their implied mystery rules. But a leprechaun wizard is not a secondary magic user. They are a full magic user without any real combat skills to fall back on, but also require another wizard in the party to teach them spells, making them only really effective as a second caster, and only really good for a party that has room for 2 wizards, one of whom does not even start knowing any spells. And could you make that work? Yeah, you could have a pair of wizard buddies splitting the cost of all their spells, but the non-leprechaun is always going to be the one who gets the final say in what spells are learned, and the GM may very well decide that that is not in the spirit of the rules, because yeah, if exploited properly, that penalty actually becomes a 2-for-1 special on spells, which is clearly not the intent. Like, let's be honest here, in ye olden days, be a bit of a dick was kind of an implied rule for GMs and players alike. Anyway, we do not qualify for Wizard Warrior, I made a magic user in the last video, and rogues are not really as great with their restrictions clearly spelled out. So I guess we're going with Warrior, who also now very much stand out above rogues thanks to their double armor proficiency. So now for equipment, we get 3d6 times 10, so 160 gold, and unfortunately the concept of huge convenient supermarkets catering to adventurers springing up around the entrance to every dungeon complex has been reduced to more of a you can find what you need in most towns, and maybe there'll be a shop near the dungeon. Which, functionally is not really a big difference, but thematically is a huge step down. Sadly, people trying to be more professional often sacrifice silliness to do so. And let's make the most of our obscene dexterity by selecting a missile weapon, and specifically let's go with a sling staff, because it is the most powerful ranged weapon we can wield with a strength of 6. A backup kukri just in case, then some leather armor, and as always, adventuring essentials. And if they can put weird restrictions on how long a character can carry weight for, presumably in the name of realism, then I can cut some of the weights in half to be consistent with our character size, although once again it really should be closer to 1/8. Our sling staff deals 3 dice with no adds, has required strength of 5 and dexterity of 11, and a range of 150 yards. And notably, the lightest bow has 2 dice with no adds, required strength of 9 and dexterity of 15, and a range of only 60 yards at 10 times the price. Our kukri deals 2 dice with 5 adds, and has a required strength of 6 and required dexterity of 6 to wield as a melee and 30 as a thrown weapon, which we are actually shockingly close to. And our leather armor reduces incoming damage by 6, which remember, as a warrior we get to double for 12 overall, and has a required strength of 2. And this character is done. And the mechanics here haven't really changed that much from previous editions, but unfortunately just enough that I have to explain them all over again. So let's descend down into the tunnels and say that Clover Thumplebump is adventuring on the first level of the dungeon with Faerith, the elven magic user, who would now be considered freakishly tall, Grimbar, the dwarven warrior, and Steve, the human warrior. Exploration is once again broken into 10-minute exploration turns, which for this party is then limited to 90-minute chunks, because with the new encumbrance rules, the entire party is basically held back by the character with the lowest constitution. In this case, Faerith, who with a constitution of 9 needs to rest every 90 minutes to avoid collapsing from exhaustion. Which also hilariously means that the average fairy needs to basically be carried around by another character to avoid having to stop every 20 to 30 minutes. And let's say that while exploring a long hallway, the GM says that after one turn, the floor rumbles beneath our feet and everyone needs to make a saving roll. Saving rolls have a base value based on the level, but that is now just a general difficulty versus previous editions where it was specifically the literal level of the dungeon you were currently on. So let's say this is a level 2 saving roll, which has a base of 25, from which we subtract the character's luck score with a minimum of 5. And that is the target we need to hit on a roll of 2d6. And you might be noticing here that most of these targets are above 12, which can be a little hard to hit on a roll of 2d6, but fortunately, if you roll doubles, you get to roll again and then add the result to your total and keep doing so as long as you keep rolling doubles. So Faerith passed and everyone else failed, falling into the pit and taking, let's say, 2 dice damage, which I am going to assume gets reduced by armor, so no damage for anyone, just mild inconvenience. Then everyone gets adventure points for making the save, which are like experience points and are actually interchangeably called experience points. So pass or fail, everyone gets adventure points equal to their roll times the level of the save, so 46, 12, 22, and 18. However, if you wanted to, you could still use the rules from previous editions, where making a save awarded experience points equal to the roll, and failing experience points equal to twice the amount by which you failed the save. Except that that is not how it worked in previous editions, unless there is a 4.5 floating around somewhere that I am unaware of, which is actually a distinct possibility with this game, as is the possibility that that was a house rule that was never actually put into the published rules, and they just kind of forgot that fact. And also in a fairly inconspicuous but major addition, the rules now state that you can implement saving throws using other attributes, which you may recall from the previous video was my suggestion of how to implement an improvised attribute check system, which was obviously a good suggestion because it turns out that's what they ended up going with. Anyway, while everyone was busy crawling out of the pit, they did fail to notice the wandering monsters wandering up to them, and now find ourselves in combat with a couple trolls and a few goblins. Once you get into combat, the game is further divided into 2-minute combat turns, or rounds. Once again, the terminology in this edition is not really consistent. And notably, monsters are not defined with full stats like characters, although they can be if you want, but rather are defined by a single monster rating, which functions as both attack value and hit points. So round 1, and compared to something like D&D, there is no turn order here. Instead, everything just kinda happens in a rough order based on action type, or rather all at once. So first, the players decide what actions their characters will take, and since the monsters are still a ways away, distance combat is the only option. Well, I guess rushing the monsters might also be an option, but it's not a good option. So it is decided that Clover will attack the closest troll with her sling staff, and Faerith, having learned her lesson from last time, starts off by casting Oh Go Away on the other, while Grimbar and Steve prepare to receive company. So first, the effects of spells are determined, and as a second level magic user with a magic staff, Oh Go Away costs Faerith 2 points of strength to cast, and the effect is determined by totaling her intelligence, luck, and charisma, and if that total is greater than the monster's rating, it goes away. Then Missile attacks, and Clover prepares to attack the closest troll with her sling staff, and the ranged combat rules have once again been completely redesigned. So now we must make a dexterity saving roll with a difficulty level determined by the target's distance and size. So for a target at near range, it is a level 2 saving roll, which is then multiplied by 2 for a large target for 4 overall, which is a base of 35 minus our dexterity of 27 for a target of 8, which, not taking into account rolling doubles, is like a 42% chance. And remember, this character has the highest possible dexterity you can have at level 1, and less than a 50% chance of hitting a 10-foot tall troll 20 feet away. In 4th edition, that would be a guaranteed hit. And if we hadn't gotten that 50% dexterity boost, the target would be 17. And like, yeah, that's possible and all, but really doesn't feel like max dexterity odds. So we roll and miss because that was a very reasonable outcome here. Then melee would occur, but cannot because no one is in melee range, so Grimbar and Steve just get into position and the monsters close the gap. Then round 2, and this time Faerith targets the troll with "Take that, you fiend," as does Clover with her sling staff, while Grimbar and Steve prepare to engage the goblins. So Faerith spends 3 points to cast "Take that, you fiend," which deals damage equal to the caster's intelligence, so 24, which we do not apply yet. Then Clover makes her attack, but now that the troll is at point blank range, the base value for the saving roll is 25, minus dexterity of 27, with a minimum of 5, and hit for 11 dice damage, plus 27 personal adds for 38 overall, which is also not yet applied. Then we move on to the melee. Grimbar's Great Axe deals 5 dice, most weapons have been increased by 1 die, plus 3, so 22, plus personal adds of 17 for 39 overall, and Steve's Gladius 3 dice plus 2 for 17 and no personal adds. Then we add all the damages together, melee, ranged, and spells, for a total of 118. And this is actually known as the hit point total, a term that I have avoided using thus far and will continue not using to avoid causing confusion with the other more common use of the term, hit point. Then the monsters roll a number of dice determined by their monster rating and add half their monster rating to that for a total of 135. And the monsters have taken the first round, so we subtract the character's attack total from the monsters and get 17 damage to the characters, which they must divide to be taken as equally as possible, which you might think would mean splitting the damage 5, 4, 4, and 4, but apparently that would be wrong. There are only 2 examples provided for splitting damage between more than 2 characters, and they are splitting 15 damage 4, 4, 4, and 3, and 10 damage 3, 3, 3, and 1. So, seemingly the intended method, if the total is not evenly divisible, is to divide evenly between all characters except 1, and then apply whatever's left over to them. So 5, 5, 5, and 2, with it being specified that magic users always take the lesser damage if they are present. And that damage is of course then reduced by armor, and once again, nobody takes any damage. Or rather, none of the characters take any damage. Even though our side lost, the spell and range attack still hit and still deal damage, so that 62 damage still applies, but only to the targeted troll. So we obliterate its monster rating of 50, but that extra 12 points of damage just fades away into the ethers. And if we had made those attacks in the previous round, that damage would have been applied just the same without even doing the attack comparison. And if you watched the previous video, you may notice that I did things very differently this time, and that is not so much because the rules have changed as much as it is because they have been explained in a way that requires less interpretation. Specifically, there is a lot more attention given to the difference between distance and melee combat in regards to spells and missile weapons, with it now being explicitly stated that Take That, You Fiend adds to the melee combat total as shown just now, and that missile attacks can be treated like a Take That, You Fiend spell. As opposed to the previous video where I ruled that the magic user and ranged character could pull back and remove themselves from the melee, both to protect their squishy bodies, but also to continue making ranged attacks since there weren't exactly rules for how to integrate them into melee. But now there are, so for this example, I am going to assume that you cannot withdraw from the melee while still remaining in the fight. Because they have made those rules clearer and also increased the strength of armor quite a bit, which makes that less necessary. But the question of whether or not it is actually allowed is still unanswered. So on to round 3, Faerith now targets the closest goblin, and Clover drops her sling staff and pulls out her kukri, because according to the rules now, there is only one instance in which missile weapons during melee is permitted, on the first melee round. In previous editions, it was suggested that ranged characters were likely to pull out a melee weapon when melee combat breaks out, but not explicitly stated that they were not permitted to continue making range attacks, but now it is explicitly stated, so stabby time. And of course, Grimbar and Steve continue fighting the goblins. So Take That, You Fiend once again does 24 damage, and Clover's Kukri does 2 dice plus 5, so 12, plus 12 personal adds, since that massive dex bonus only applies to range attacks, for 24. Then Grimbar rolls for a total of 44, and Steve for 15. For a grand total of 107. And the monsters roll for 82. Notably continuing to add half their monster rating, whereas in previous editions, it went down to 1/4 after the first melee round. So this time we win, and after subtracting the monster's total from ours, are left with 25 damage. However, remember that Take That, You Fiend deals 24 damage, which is applied to the first goblin, and then that 24 removed from the total damage, leaving 1 damage to divide as equally as possible, so let's just say the second one takes it. And if that damage total had been less than the total of the spell, it still would have done full damage, just with no additional left over. Then round 4, and Faerith targets the furthest goblin, while everyone else just gives them a guided tour of Stabby Town. So 24 from Faerith, 29 from Clover, 40 from Grimbar, and 9 from Steve for 102 versus 60 for the monsters. And notably, when applying the half monster rating, it is stated that the preferred method is to round up, which is mathematically correct, but also just feels weird because I'm so used to rounding decimals down in games. And yes, of course, you only round up when it's for the monsters. So 42 damage, with 24 going directly to Goblin 3, and 18 left over to split between them, so 6 each. And Goblins 1 and 3 are dead, but the last one is still at more than half monster rating and feeling feisty, so round 5. And at this point, it's not really worth spending the strength points, so Faerith joins in on the beatdown with her staff, which deals 2 dice, so 7. But since she spent so much strength on spells, her personal adds have been reduced from +6 to -2, so 5 overall. Then 27 from Clover, 36 from Grimbar, and 12 from Steve for 80 total versus 17 for 63 damage, and that goblin is extra dead. So, as I said in the last video, it is a very interesting combat system, especially if you are most familiar with wargame style combat games like D&D. It is very much scene-based rather than action-based. Like, I kept things simple here to save time. I didn't describe the big epic fights that were going on, but remember, each round here is 2 minutes of exciting action. When you roll, it's not just a single attack, but multiple attacks, positioning, dodging, and just dumb luck all summed up in a single roll. That's why strength, luck, and dexterity are added to every attack. It is a roll for your overall combat ability over the course of 2 minutes. And this abstracted approach really lends itself to more cinematic combat scenarios. Something like fighting a horde of goblins while running through the collapsing bridges and walkways of their cavernous lair is impractical at best and impossible at worst in something like D&D. But here doesn't really require any adjustment to the mechanics because the space in your imagination is limitless. This is even addressed with the classic Tunnels and Trolls flippancy in the 5th edition book, which has an entire section on miniatures in TNT, which basically just says, Tunnels and Trolls was never designed originally to be used with miniatures, and in all honesty, it isn't now. Remember, the reason I keep comparing this game to D&D specifically is because it was designed as a direct response to D&D, intended to be something you could play with your friends at a reasonable price with reasonable equipment. It was very intentionally designed to be a fantasy adventure game that did not require all the wargaming paraphernalia that D&D did, because it was made by someone who just didn't have that pre-existing investment in wargaming. Also, you may notice that compared to the previous editions, the numbers here are quite a bit higher. We've got more dice and more adds, and also much higher armor values. However, those doubled armor values for warriors also significantly increase the existing armor gap between warriors and everyone else. Like, any hit that actually penetrates Clover's leather armor would kill Faerith. So it becomes one of those situations where you have to either plan for the characters who can shrug off 20 damage, which for a warrior is not hard to do, or the ones who can't. Because as far as I know, there isn't actually any way for the more durable characters to absorb a greater portion of the damage. Unless there is some house rule somewhere in the never published part of the mechanics, which solves that problem perfectly. Anyway, for defeating the monsters, we receive adventure points equal to the total monster values of all of the monsters we defeated, and maybe half for the one that ran away. I'm just gonna say yes on that one. And we could give the entire adventure point value to each character, or divide it between them. Yeah, previous editions did not specify if awards were per character or split between them, and this one just says, do either. Or alternatively, because this battle was against 2 trolls and 3 goblins, we could just award experience for 1 troll and 1 goblin. An option that somehow got written and published in this book without anyone stopping to say, wow, that's actually terrible and nobody wants that. But let's just be a cool GM here and award each character the full 165 adventure points, and then return to the surface to address some more changes. We still get 100 experience points per level for daring, but now, as I have mentioned, level is simply a difficulty level rather than the literal dungeon level, but it's also still that too, so 100 experience points. And of course the big change here, treasure and magic items no longer grant experience points because that honestly never really made sense to begin with. And what's this? It looks like the XP fairy is coming to bestow upon us 723 adventure points for no particular reason, which coincidentally just happens to be enough to level up. And upon leveling up, we have our choice of adding the new level number points to Strength or Constitution, double to Luck, half to Intelligence, Dexterity, or Charisma, or half each to Strength and Constitution. And this time it is specified that the non-Strength and Constitution advancements may be taken while inside a dungeon, only with the GM's agreement, so this time, no leveling up in the dungeon. And of course, it does also specify to round down when having the odd numbers, because round up when it benefits the game master and round down when it benefits the players was actually not that uncommon in older games. Although personally, I would just recommend keeping the half points, like there's no reason they have to be rounded to a whole number. And since most of the kin modifiers are plus or minus 50%, there's a good chance that a character is going to start with half points. So keeping those half points and giving players the opportunity to increase them with more half points later will probably encourage them to buy more of those half level bonuses instead of dumping everything into luck and constitution. And speaking of which, let's just dump this into luck, which for some reason gets 2 times level points. So +4 to saves, but also, now that it's 13, +1 to our combat adds, with further additions to luck adding to our combat adds on a 1-to-1 basis. So at level 3, if we choose luck again, we can get +6 to both saves and adds. And that was a Tunnels and Trolls 5th edition character. The first almost completely revised edition. Honestly, it feels more like a 4.8, like they really just needed a couple more good editing passes to smooth out some of the more confusing phrasing and inconsistent terminology. Like, the index still lists a Dungeon Master section, despite it being changed to Game Master throughout. But overall, it is a better and much clearer version of the game, aside from the incredibly more difficult range attacks. And navigating the book can also still be something of a nightmare, just not as bad as in the previous editions. And it may not seem like a lot from a modern perspective, but there definitely was some effort here to be more inclusive with the language, with frequent use of he or she throughout to refer to players and characters. And I believe I ended up cutting it from the first video for time, but even in 1st edition, characters are referred to as brave men and women, which, as I said, isn't much from a modern perspective, but does at least show some interest in including the distaff gamer from the very beginning. One of whom just happened to be the editor and main illustrator, and probably deserves a bit of the credit on that front. Mind you, once again, it's not perfect. They still have the slavery rules, the spell still has that name, and just like Gary Gygax, Ken St. Andre was not above putting a rule in the game that was clearly a petty vindictive jab at someone he had a disagreement with. And as mentioned at the beginning of the video, this would be the edition of Tunnels and Trolls for more than 25 years. Kinda, and can be considered the final classic edition before the one that I'm going to talk about next time. And some of you know exactly why I am being so weird and cagey about naming these specific editions I'm going to be covering, and the rest of you are in for quite a wild ride. And thank you for watching. If you enjoy the wacky things I say and do, you can follow me on Blue Sky and/or Tumblr. You can also join me live on Twitch, where sometimes things get a little weird. And extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Hasterfan, Mix Woofers, Nikolai Snowtail, Puggo, Randy Mulholland, Renee D, Stephen Kramer, Tila Glar, Toshiro Kuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you want to be cool like them, check out my Patreon or YouTube channel memberships, 2 different things that provide similar but distinct benefits. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that have mysteriously manifested from the ethers, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.